If you want a really comprehensive history of the first 2,000 years of Christianity, then there are a couple of resources that I can point you to. The first of those, if you've got the time, is Diarmaid MacCulloch's absolute whopper of a book, A History of Christianity. It's superb. It's well over 1,000 pages long. Probably not great for bedtime reading or reading on the bus or anywhere, but if you want it, it's well worth getting hold of. The good news is that Diarmaid MacCulloch hasn't only written his book, he also made it into a 6-part BBC series, which is available as DVD, and I'm pretty sure all the episodes can be found on YouTube as well. And that's really good, really worthwhile, and I do recommend that if you have some time, 6 hours over the next few weeks, do look it up. If neither of those appeal and you've only got half an hour, then the next 30 minutes that I'm offering might just give you a flavour of what the church has been doing for the last 2,000 years. But it is only a flavour, and it needs to come with a warning. The warning is that as you listen to this and as you see the slides, you will see virtually no women, you'll see virtually no non-Europeans. It's not really a history of Christianity, it's a history of a particular strand of church leadership. I'll be talking of about 70 people, and there have been billions who've worshipped Jesus since those very first days. So with that warning in mind, do listen and watch, and I hope that it will pique your interest, as indeed some of the other talks that you will see from me, to go that bit deeper and perhaps find out more about some of the unnamed people, the people whose influence on the Christian faith in God's eyes is as important as any Martin Luther, John Calvin or John Wesley, because this is a history of the full people of God, not just the few names that I'm about to mention. In the first 70 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the church grew rapidly out of its base in Judea. The persecution that broke out in Jerusalem scattered the disciples across the region. It was in Antioch, the great port city on the eastern Mediterranean coast, that the disciples were first called Christians. The missionary journeys of St. Paul, as recorded in Acts and in Paul's letters, took the gospel all over the Mediterranean. Other missionaries, unrecorded in the Bible, preached the gospel in Africa, Asia, and maybe even as far as India. St. Paul and St. Peter were executed in Rome by the orders of the Emperor Nero round about AD 65. Within a few years, a terrible calamity struck the Jewish people with the failed revolt against Rome and the subsequent fall of Jerusalem and sacking of the temple in AD 70. Christians, perhaps heeding Jesus' warnings as recorded in Mark chapter 13, played little part in the revolt and fled Jerusalem before its fall. Partly as a result of this, Christians began to be seen no longer as a Jewish sect, but as a separate religion. As the church spread through the Roman world, so Christians found themselves increasingly having to defend their faith intellectually against Roman and Greek philosophers. The Greek word for defence is apologia, and those Christians who publicly argued their faith were called the APOLOGISTS. The most prominent of these was Justin Martyr, who was executed in 165. He was a pagan thinker who was converted to Christianity. He was able to argue for the Christian faith using Greek systems of philosophical thought. Another famous martyr of this period was Ignatius of Antioch, whose letters to Corinth, Rome and other cities give us a flavour of the Christian church in the generation after the first apostles. In Gaul, modern-day France, the Bishop of Lyon, Irenaeus, wrote a famous book on heresies, which defended Christian beliefs against emerging unorthodox views of Jesus. Not all Christians were comfortable with Christianity being repackaged with Greek philosophy. The great 3rd century theologian Tertullian famously asked, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" He was the first major Christian writer to use Latin rather than Greek, bringing Christianity further into the orbit of Roman thought and culture. Tertullian also gives us the first clear evidence that the Church baptised children, a practice of which he disapproved. Christians had been persecuted sporadically from the first, but Roman persecution became more organised from 250 onwards, culminating in the Great Persecution under Emperor Diocletian, where entire Christian communities were destroyed. Many renounced their faith under threat of torture. The question as to whether these apostates could later return to faith was to cause a major split in the Church. The great turning point for the Christian Church happened in 312 with the conversion of Constantine, a Roman general who attributed his victory in battle to the Christian God. On becoming emperor, he made Christianity the empire's favoured religion. After Constantine, Christians could worship freely, build magnificent churches and openly hold positions of power. One little-known immediate impact was an outbreak of persecution against Christians in Persia, where the Christian identification with the Roman Empire immediately placed the faith at odds with Rome's traditional enemies. Dismayed by the growing theological divisions among Christians, particularly the Arian controversy, which doubted the true divinity of Jesus, Constantine called a general council of the bishops of the Church to resolve matters of doctrine. The resulting Council of Nicaea definitively concluded that Jesus Christ was of one essence or being with the Father. These arguments were robustly taken up by the pugnacious Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, who defended the Nicene position fearlessly even when Roman emperors opposed him. The Nicene Creed continues to be said at most services of Holy Communion to this day. The fall of Rome in 410 shook Western Christianity, particularly as the new barbarian rulers favoured Arianism over Nicene Christianity. The city that had been portrayed as Babylon in the book of Revelation had become the Christian citadel. What were Christians to make of God's purposes in its overthrow? The theologian who did most to answer this question was St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the greatest theologians in the history of the Church. St. Augustine's massive book, City of God, written after the fall of Rome, is one of many such books that he wrote. His most famous and readable work, Confessions, has the merit of being the first modern autobiography. His book, The Trinity, had incalculable influence in later understandings of the nature of God. Writing in Latin, with virtually no knowledge of Greek, Augustine represents one of the breakpoints between Western and Eastern Christianity. In the East, the great theologians known as the Cappadocian Fathers, Basil, Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory Nazianzus, also produced very influential works on the Trinity and the nature of Christ, but they became little known in the West until recent times. The 5th century was also the century in which St. Jerome translated the Greek scriptures into Latin. Divisions about the nature of Jesus Christ had not been ended by Nicaea. There remained the very difficult question of whether the Jesus who died on the cross had a fully human soul capable like us of sin, or whether the Word incarnate in Jesus Christ was divine and therefore qualitatively different to a human soul. This seems an obscure point, but the implications were profound. Did God really die on the cross? Was Jesus just like us? At the Council of Chalcedon in 451, these issues were thrashed out until a majority position was reached that Christ had two natures, fully divine and fully human. Sadly, Chalcedon's definition was not accepted by many Christians, particularly those in Egypt, the Coptic Church, and Syria. They were effectively excluded from the Orthodox Church, and many later would find a more hospitable faith in Islam. Far away from Chalcedon, Christianity was advancing through the former Roman territories. Pope Gregory the Great, supposedly after being struck by the beauty of some Anglo-Saxon slaves, authorised a missionary named Augustine to lead the conversion of England. Augustine arrived in 597, and over the next century most of England was converted. The Isle of Wight was the last place to accept Christianity. Augustine was a monk from Rome, part of a large and growing movement of monasticism that had been developing for 200 years. Desert hermits in the tradition of St. Anthony of Egypt had gathered followers around them and begun living as a community. In the West, this way of living was formalised by St. Benedict of Nursia, whose Benedictine rule remains integral to much of monastic and church life and worship today. One model of monasticism was the isolated life of prayer and service within a community. Another model, practised particularly in Ireland, was that of missionary monasticism. St. Patrick had evangelised the Irish, and the Celtic tradition included such missionaries as Saints Aidan, Cuthbert, Chad, Columba and Ninian. They evangelised much of Scotland and northern England. They had different practices to the Roman Church in southern England. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, Roman Christianity was acknowledged as the official British version of the faith. In Arabia, a religious prophet and warrior, Muhammad, was gathering his own group of devotees around him and banishing paganism from the peninsula. The rise of Islam would take the Christian world by surprise as, through conversion and the sword, it began to conquer the Christian heartlands of the Middle East. For the next 800 years, Christianity would be preoccupied with defending itself against this vigorous and seemingly invincible religion. Eastern Christianity, with its religious and political capital in Constantinople, was fast developing in a different direction to Western Christianity, with a subtly different theology and different practices of worship. The use of icons in religious worship was a particular distinctive in Eastern Christianity. The successful attacks by Muslim armies against the Byzantine Empire had prompted the Eastern Emperor to see God's judgment upon his church. Fearful that icons had become idols, in 726 he demanded that all icons be destroyed and persecuted those who worshipped them. This iconoclasm prompted rioting in Constantinople and was officially condemned by the Pope in Rome. For the next 150 years, emperors would veer between opposing or supporting icons, before eventually icons were recognised as an integral part of Eastern Christian worship. In the Western Church, an English missionary, St. Boniface, travelled to the fearsome lands of northern Europe, where plenty of Christian missionaries had been martyred. With others, he was responsible for the conversion of Germany. Far away in China, Syrian missionaries were preaching the Christian faith, the earliest evidence of which dates to 781. The Christian faith continued to advance with the conversion of Russia in 988 by Byzantine missionaries. Russia would henceforth come under the Eastern Orthodox faith rather than Western Christianity. In the West, Christianity became further politicised when the mighty King Charlemagne, ruler of most of Western Europe, was crowned Christian emperor by the Pope. Charlemagne was deeply interested in theology as well as politics, and his empire, in one form or another, existed for 1,000 years as the Holy Roman Empire. The Church in Rome became inextricably tangled up with European politics and wars. The great theologian of this period was the Archbishop of Canterbury, St. Anselm, who arrived in England with the Normans after 1066. Anselm was a philosopher and theologian. His two most famous contributions to theology are the ontological argument, in which he sought to prove the existence of God through human reasoning, and his treatise Why God Became Man, in which he put forward a theory of the atonement that is still influential today. Relations between the two halves of European Christianity became steadily worse as political and religious differences widened. The iconoclasm crisis had put the Pope and the Emperor at odds with each other, as had the crowning of Charlemagne as Emperor. There was also a growing and bitter dispute about the Western Church's alteration of the Nicene Creed in respect of the Holy Spirit. in 1054, the Pope demanded that the Eastern Church accept Roman supremacy, and when this demand was refused, both sides excommunicated one another. This event is known as the Great Schism. Any possibility of reconciliation was ruined by the atrocities of the Crusades. By the 12th century, the Muslim armies had conquered all of North Africa and most of the Middle East, including Jerusalem. In 1095, the Pope appealed for a crusade to reconquer the Holy Land. There was an enthusiastic response, and Jerusalem was reconquered, with the population in the city of all three faiths massacred. Subsequent crusades were less successful, if you want to use that word, and Jerusalem was recaptured, although without the same level of bloodshed, by the Muslims in 1187. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 ended up with Constantinople being besieged and pillaged by the Christian Crusaders, fatally weakening the Byzantine Empire and destroying any remaining civil relations between East and West. Possibly the most significant figure of the age was Bernard of Clairvaux, who reinvigorated the monastic movement with the founding of 65 monasteries in the Cistercian order, and was amongst the first of the medieval mystics whose influence, despite often coming from the margins of society, proved to be incalculable in the history of Christian spirituality. Thomas à Kempis, Julian of Norwich, through to St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, presented a spirituality that was visionary and experiential, often at odds with the power and the politics of Rome. The Middle Ages were a time of terrific intellectual ferment in Europe. Thomas Aquinas, possibly the greatest and most prolific theologian between Augustine and the Reformation, systematised Christian thought and, using the philosophical premises of Aristotle, made connections between divine revelation and human reason. His theology remains influential today, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church. At the other end of the theological spectrum, popular intellectual and spiritual movements grew up which challenged the Church. St. Francis of Assisi famously rejected his wealthy background and preached a radical gospel of poverty and humility. He was joined in this by St. Clare, who was the first woman to write a monastic rule. In 1210, the Franciscan order was founded. Unlike many religious leaders, St. Francis was unwavering in his principles, refusing worldly honour and wealth, and remained amongst ordinary people whilst living in utter poverty. Sadly, the Church rarely followed St. Francis's example, and this is also the period of the Inquisition, where those who disagreed with the teaching of Rome or who followed heretical doctrines were systematically persecuted and put to death. This was particularly intense in southern Europe, where tens of thousands of faithful Christian worshippers were murdered. What we now see as an incipient Protestantism began to grow through the teaching of individuals like Jan Hus, martyred in 1415, and John Wycliffe. Wycliffe surprisingly avoided martyrdom, although many of his followers, called Lollards, were not so lucky. Wycliffe inspired the first complete translation of the Bible into English, which was carried out by his followers. In 1348-9, Europe was struck by a catastrophic plague. About 40% of the population died through the Black Death. The casualty rate was highest among the clergy who ministered to the sick. The Black Death radically changed European society, effectively ending feudalism and prompting many to question received religion and patterns of faith. Sadly, one of the results of the Black Death was an increase in anti-Semitism, the Jews being blamed for the catastrophe by poisoning Christian wells, and anti-Semitism has blighted the Church ever since. In the 1450s, two seismic events happened in Europe. In 1453, after centuries of rearguard actions and defence, the city of Constantinople finally fell to the Turkish armies. After Constantinople fell, the Turkish armies swept through Eastern Europe, and over the next 200 years, most of southeastern Europe would be ruled by the Turks. The Eastern Roman Empire was finished, and Eastern Christianity now had its stronghold in Russia, who called itself the Third Rome. In 1456, in Mainz, Germany, Johann Gutenberg printed the first Bible using movable type. Within 40 years, there were printing presses in every major European city. This had dramatic implications for the spread of new ideas. The new learning, also known as the Renaissance, changed the way people thought about the world and humanity's place in it. The spread of the printed word took learning out of monasteries and universities and distributed it to anyone who was literate. In Rotterdam, Erasmus, one of the great intellectuals, also called humanists of the age, published the Greek New Testament. For the first time, anyone who could read Greek could see what the original texts of the New Testament said, not their Latin translations. The new learning and rapid dissemination of information coincided with a period of terrible corruption and debasement of the papacy, frequently under the power of the super-rich de' Medici family. On 31st of October 1517, Martin Luther, a university professor, published 95 theses opposing papal indulgences, money paid to the church to remit time in purgatory. The church authorities overreacted and the situation escalated out of control. The Reformation had begun. The Reformation began in Germany but quickly spread throughout Northern Europe, where Roman power was more fragile and where the political situation gave advantages to kings and princes to throw off Roman power, just like Henry VIII in England. Luther turned back to Scripture as the sole authority for Christian faith and rejected many of the traditions of Rome which he felt had no scriptural warrant. He believed strongly that salvation came solely through faith in Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, not through the conduct of religious duties. Luther was followed by two very significant reforming theologians, the Swiss theologian Huldrych Zwingli and the French theologian John Calvin. Over time, Protestant Europe became divided between the Lutheran countries of Germany and Scandinavia and the Calvinist Reformed faith of Western Europe. The Reformation in Britain was Calvinist, although with its own particular flavour, beautifully demonstrated through the liturgy of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. France was bitterly divided between Calvinist and Catholic factions, resulting in terrible bloodshed before Protestants were effectively exiled. Calvinism, with its black and white view of the world, did not always sit well with traditional European societies, but it found sympathetic communities in the New World of America, taken there by the likes of the Pilgrim Fathers. The Roman response was not slow in coming. The Council of Trent, 1445-63, restated Catholic teaching and reformed the sale of indulgences. Attempts to reconcile the reformers of the Catholic Church got nowhere. The most significant Catholic theologian of this period is Ignatius of Loyola. He is mostly famous for two things: the series of spiritual exercises, which remain one of the most popular devotional disciplines in the Church, and the founding of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, which was to spearhead global Catholic mission for the next 200 years. The sharp divisions between Catholic and Protestant understandings of the Christian faith caused bloodshed from the very beginning. By the 17th century, faith and politics were so intertwined that religious wars became endemic. The wars of religion affected Britain, France, and most of Northern Europe. In Britain, the Elizabethan settlement, by which a moderate Protestantism triumphed over Catholicism and Puritanism, became undone under the High Church King Charles I. A civil war was fought between 1641 and 1649 and narrowly averted 40 years later. The result saw many Puritans emigrate to the New World. In Germany, the 30 Years' War saw a third of the German population killed in terrible fighting and famine that eventually engulfed most of Northern Europe. These wars often started over religious difficulties, but were continued as a result of political power grabbing by the great European powers. The extreme bloodshed in the name of religion encouraged many free thinkers to spurn the Christian faith and seek out other less confrontational ways to truth. This was also the century in which world evangelism saw the Christian faith spread dramatically outside the heartland of Europe. North America became mostly Protestant, South America strongly Catholic. The Jesuits conducted brave mission in Asia, often at the cost of martyrdom, most notably in Japan. Christian evangelism, sadly, also was partly responsible for the steady growth of the slave trade. It was not all bad, though. The 17th century witnessed a great flourishing of human creativity in art and literature, much of it inspired by the Christian faith. The poets George Herbert, John Donne and John Milton, the artist Rembrandt and later the composer Johann Sebastian Bach showed just how transcendent Christian faith could be when expressed through human creativity. The disillusionment with the Christian faith that grew out of the wars of religion created the climate for scepticism and atheism that was particularly prominent in France. Philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot openly mocked the Christian faith and believed that it held back human advancement. Their philosophy, combined with French bankruptcy caused by continued wars with Britain, eventually resulted in the French Revolution of 1789. The revolution was openly anti-Christian, and as the French armies conquered almost all of Europe over the next 30 years, this philosophy was exported to other nations. Despite significant political turmoil, Britain did not suffer from a political revolution. But Britain did undergo a religious revolution in the form of the Methodist revival, which took off dramatically in the mid-18th centuries as the Anglican priests John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield took the gospel to the new working classes and preached to crowds of thousands across Britain and America. Independently of the Wesleys, the American Puritan preacher Jonathan Edwards spearheaded the Great Awakening in the American colonies. Between them, the Methodists and Edwards can be considered among the founders of what is now called evangelicalism. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the rapid advancement in technology and scientific learning that was later called the Industrial Revolution. This resulted in a huge growth in urban population, particularly in towns like Manchester, Sheffield and Leeds. It also resulted in the new phenomenon of an urban working class. It quickly became apparent that these cities were virtually untouched by Christianity. Big new churches were built, but they were never filled. The Church of England had limited success in evangelising the cities. More successful were evangelists like William and Catherine Booth and their Salvation Army. In 1829, Catholics were finally allowed to worship freely in Britain. But paranoia about the influence of Roman Catholicism in British life continued to dominate religious discussion, reaching a peak when John Henry Newman, a writer and theologian, renounced his Anglican orders and crossed over to Rome. The Oxford movement of High Church Anglicans grew in influence despite their connections with Catholicism. Those who remained in the Church of England were known as Anglo-Catholics. Many Anglo-Catholic priests, such as the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, devoted themselves to working in the toughest urban parishes of East London and the northern cities. Africa was almost entirely colonised by Europeans in this century. The European empires and Christianity have an uneasy relationship with faith, trade and conquest, too often going hand in hand. If much of sub-Saharan Africa owes its Christian faith to Europe, so also does it owe apartheid, unfair trade practices and unstable governments. It should of course be remembered that there were churches in Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia and North Africa long before they were planted in Britain. Intellectual challenges to the Christian faith came from two key sources: modern biblical scholarship and the rapid development of a scientific worldview. Higher criticism of the Bible cast doubts on the reliability of Scripture, particularly its authorship. Christian theologians had to wrestle with questions of divine inspiration mediated through fallible human authors. In science, geological discoveries and the theory of evolution put forward by Charles Darwin, amongst others, gave ammunition to those who wanted to pull Christian faith down, even though Darwin's theory was not initially considered that controversial by many church leaders. The 20th century was dominated by 2 devastating world wars and 1 long-running Cold War. The world became increasingly divided between the secular faiths of capitalism and communism and the 2 religious faiths of Christianity and Islam. In theology, German writers dominated Christian thought. Some, like Rudolf Bultmann, sought to demythologise Christianity so that it might fit more comfortably into the modern world. Others, like Karl Barth, promoted a vigorous orthodoxy based on divine revelation rather than simply human reason. Dietrich von Bonhoeffer sought to ground the church not in abstract or pious faith, but in the challenge of Jesus Christ. He called for a religionless Christianity that avoided cheap grace, but faced up to the momentous challenge of the Sermon on the Mount. He was executed by the Nazis in 1945, having chosen to return to Germany in 1939 to face suffering with the German people. The 20th century was in many ways the ecumenical century and the evangelical century. The challenges of war and secularism brought denominations together with historic doctrinal differences seemingly less important against the overwhelming suffering in the world. Evangelical Christianity, especially in America, became an increasingly important cross-denominational part of the worldwide church, with globe-trotting evangelists like Billy Graham preaching to millions of all nationalities and church traditions. Pentecostalism was born in a church in Azusa Street, San Francisco in 1906, and the dramatic manifestations of the Spirit, such as speaking in tongues and the working of miracles, birthed new churches in their thousands and became part of the mainstream faith of most Christian denominations. The Church in Rome was not immune to these changes. The Second Vatican Council sought to modernise many aspects of Roman Catholicism, as well as adopting a more open stance towards the secular world and other Christian denominations. Not all of these modernisations were welcomed. Liberation theology that grew out of South America was looked upon with deep suspicion in Rome. In the East, the Orthodox Church spent much of the 20th century under communist rule, severely restricted in its worship. The 21st century is only 20 years in, but already we see some of the trends likely to determine the first half. Pope Francis has been a huge influence in the Catholic Church and seeking to carry the principles of Vatican II much further. After 1,000 years, it seems that even the breach between East and West might be narrowing. Christianity is booming in many of the developing countries. China probably has more Christian worshippers than the whole of Europe. Brazil has seen a Pentecostal revolution. India has an underground church of millions. This surge in Christian evangelism has not been uniform. In the West, Christianity continues to decline in influence, consuming itself in its own debates about sexuality and ethics. In the Middle East and Asia, Christianity is being all but wiped out through terrible persecution. By the middle of the 21st century, it is possible that the Christian church will be much larger worldwide, but almost entirely absent in its historic heartlands of Europe and the Near East. With the growth of the internet and online church, perhaps we're about to see another seismic shift in the never predictable history of Christianity.